Welcome to Daily Devo. I'm Pat. Today we're going to talk about the habit of perspective. Why do children have parents? For most of it, that seems like a silly, almost ignorant question. Are you kidding me? Do you really not understand why children need parents? Because they're not ready to survive on their own. Because even once they reach an age where they might survive physically, they aren't ready to live socially and morally because they need guidance and education and equipping. Well, we have two letters in the New Testament that are written to some Jesus followers in a place called Corinth. And Paul is writing them and dealing with all kinds of problems that are primarily a result of them continually insisting on living in spiritual infancy. Paul actually tells them early in his letter that they should be further along in their spiritual journey, but instead are acting and thinking like children. To name a few of the issues Paul is confronting, they're dealing with petty arguments over who their favorite preachers are. Aren't you glad we don't do that in the church anymore? They're participating in or putting up with gross sexual immorality, and they're running to court suing one another. Aren't you glad we don't do that anymore in the church? So Paul has to expose this behavior and lay down some principles and practices for living out this life of faith. And part of what Paul is doing is actually what we spent this month in our Daily Devo doing, identifying rhythms, routines, and habits that are beneficial in helping us look and act more like Jesus. One of these principles of living that out that Paul identifies is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12. He writes this: "You say, I'm allowed to do anything, but not everything is good for you. And even though I'm allowed to do anything, I must not become a slave to anything." Now, it's important to understand or recognize that Paul is dealing with things they could do, or in our case, things we can do that are not morally wrong when he says that we can do anything. In other words, these are behaviors and actions that are permissible, but Paul is asking us to hit the pause button. See, what Paul means is that in this verse is that just because something is technically legal doesn't mean that it's spiritually appropriate. Just because something is permissible doesn't mean that it's profitable. Let me say that again. Just because something is permissible doesn't mean that it is profitable. Why? Because if we went around doing whatever we thought we could get by with, we would end up becoming slaves to our passions. And you know who does that? Children. Simply put, Paul is saying, be very careful what you allow to control you. He's really calling for a perspective change when it comes to what we might call the gray areas of our lives. These areas in which there's not a clearly articulated right or wrong. We might say that Paul is imploring us to create the habit of perspective. You see, you and I go through our days and are consistently confronted with decisions in how we think or how we act and how we respond in these gray areas. These areas where there are no clearly defined boundaries. The decisions we make in these gray areas is often a result of the perspective we choose to see these choices through. See, the habit of perspective for these gray areas of life means that we hit the pause button. We step back and we have a conversation with the Spirit of God. We ask, I know this is permissible. I know I can legally do this, but is it profitable for me and for the kingdom of God? That's creating the habit of perspective. It's asking, is this something that will help move me forward to becoming a more mature follower of Jesus, or is this something that will hold me back? That's creating the habit of perspective. It's asking, is this something that will help me serve others and point others to Jesus, or is this something that will inhibit me pointing people to Jesus? That's creating a habit of perspective. You see, children have the perspective, if I can, I will. Mature adults should have the perspective, if it's beneficial, I will. And Paul is reminding us to act more like adults in our perspective of these gray areas. It's not if I can, I will, but instead, if it's beneficial, I will. That's the habit of perspective.